Hi, today we're going to be talking about writing your own writing rubrics for your classroom. So, I've studied a lot of different writing rubrics in my time, and one of the main ones I've been working with lately is a national rubric called the AAC&U, which is the Association of Colleges and Universities Written Communication Rubric. And from that rubric, they have a great definition of written communication. So I thought we would start there. So, what is written communication? Well, it involves the development of expression and expression of ideas. It also means learning to write in different genres, learning to write in different styles. It could include using data or images, not just linguistic text. And it also is something that should be developed throughout the curriculum and not just in one course or not just in the English department. Next thing we need to find is what is a writing rubric or what is a rubric in general. So a rubric is a scoring guide that specifies a point scale. So you may be thinking any type of grading criteria is a rubric, but that's not true. It's really a specific type of grading criteria in which it has different points on a scale and it talks about the features of each of those points. There are, however, different types of writing rubrics. There's holistic rubrics, there's analytical rubrics, and there's primary trait rubrics. We're going to focus mostly on the analytical today. Holistic rubric would have an overall score. In this case, it's like a point strong. It could be like an A or a B, and then kind of just an overall, what are all the things that happen in that? So it's not by individual dimension. Instead, it's an overall holistic score. An analytical trait rubric or analytical rubric is probably what you're more used to seeing, though. So this is a breakdown from the ANC&U and one of their rubrics about the different parts of a rubric. And a primary trait rubric actually would only involve one of these dimensions. So if you really wanted to just look at the sources or just look at how a student was doing a particular thing, then you would just use basically one row of this, and that would be a primary trait rubric. So this is an analytical rubric. So the different parts I want to go over so that we understand how to refer to those when we're talking to each other about rubrics. So on the left-hand side here, we have the dimensions of the rubric. So these are the categories that you are assessing. So in this case, you'll see things like explanation of the issues, evidence. So what are those different things that you are looking for? Up here, you have the performance levels. So these levels are, in this case, numerical, but you may, if you're using this in the classroom, have them be grading levels, A, B, C, D, that kind of thing. You may have them be a certain number of points. One of the things that AAC&U calls for is starting with the highest level so that you're really using a more asset-based approach to your grading than a deficit-based approach. So you really start with where does the student want to end up and what is the highest level for you. And then below are each of these performance descriptors where it explains how these two line up. What in this dimension is this particular performance level look like? And you want to be really consistent here in the types of language you use across the different performance descriptors. Now, the AAC&U rubrics will also have a definition on them. So that's where that definition of written communication came from. They'll have some framing language that talks about how the rubric was developed, and they'll have a glossary. These rubrics are created really for national assessment or university-wide or school-wide assessment, not really for the classroom. So you probably don't need all of this on a classroom rubric, but a glossary could be a really nice addition because sometimes students don't know all the words that you're using on a rubric or all the terms. Like in this case, there's a definition of context. What does that mean? So you might define context or audience or evidence or things like that in a separate glossary that goes with your rubric. So let's talk about the dimensions that you might use. So these dimensions come from that national rubric that I've been studying on written communication. And we're just going to go over each one and talk about what it means and if you might use it in your classroom. So context and purpose for writing. I think this is a really important thing that people often leave off of assignments and don't talk about with their students. But who are they writing for? And how does that affect their writing? What's their purpose? A myth here that you might want to combat is that anyone should be able to understand the text. Instead, you should think about who's really going to read this, who also is the writer, what is their purpose? How is that text potentially going to be circulated? Again, who's going to actually read it? Is it something that's just for the classroom? Is it something that you want to give them an outside audience? Are they writing a letter to the editor? Students will often think audience is very general, and if something's going on the internet, well, anybody can read it. But that's not really how the internet works. Like, you have to search for certain things. You probably aren't just going to come across something, especially a student project. So thinking about that, but also thinking about what other factors in society maybe influence this text. What's the timeliness of it? If they're talking about a particular issue, what has been said about it recently comes into this idea of the context and the purpose of writing. So these are things that you may not have considered including on your rubric. But they may be things that are really important for you to teach in your classroom. So if you're teaching them, they should be on your rubric. Content development. So this is where ideas come in and the content of the paper, which is always going to be important. But I think there's a myth that writing just involves translating ideas. And instead, we really see that ideas are shaped throughout writing, and the topic is always going to be represented differently depending on who the audience is. And so this is something you want to think about defining for your students and talking to your students about as well. All right, genre and disciplinary conventions. This is a type of terminology you might not want to use on a classroom-based rubric because your students might not understand it. However, you want to fight this myth that everyone agrees on what good writing looks like, and instead try to define how your particular writing that you're asking for in this assignment is defined by a particular genre or a particular discipline. So they're writing for a particular course, a particular field of study. They're writing in a particular style. And if they're not, I would ask yourself, why not? Why are you assigning something very, generic in the very general sense? Why not make it something more specific? Could they be writing a film review instead of just like a few paragraphs of responding to the film? Could it be in this genre that would be used in everyday discourse? All right, sources and evidence. Another good thing to include, and often we are trying to teach them when we're trying to teach them writing, is how to use evidence in their papers. But there is a myth that all academic texts will use sources in the same way. And one of the things I often see is that students come from high school with ideas about how they should use sources that are really very particular to English classes or humanities classes, like they should use a lot of direct quotes. And then they get to a science class and maybe their science professor says you should never use a direct quote. So you need to define these things, but also explain to your students that they vary depending on what class or what discipline they're working for. Control of syntax and mechanics is the last category on the big national value rubric for written communication. And you've probably heard this called different things: style and mechanics, grammar and mechanics. I think the main thing to think about here is there's lots of different reasons why students might make errors in their paper. And even who defines an error is up for debate. So students don't just make errors because they don't proofread their papers. And in fact, readers are the ones who actually define what counts as an error. There was a really famous study about this where a professor wrote a paper for an academic journal and just put a bunch of errors in there, and then said at the end of his essay, I bet you didn't catch most of those because you weren't reading this the way you would read a student paper. You're reading this the way you read a professor's essay. So you, the reader, defined what was an error. I think this is very true too when we talk about standard academic or standard American English. We assume that that's accessible to every reader or every writer and that they just haven't proofread if they aren't getting there, when actually their language background really affects that. And you can use alternative grammars in really powerful ways. There is academic writing that's written in Black English or other grammars. So all of this might sound very complicated, and maybe you thought rubrics would just be a really easy way to grade in your classroom. But I'm going to talk you through some things to do when you're thinking about making a rubric. And I think here, you as a teacher, you're also a writer, and you're a writer as a teacher. So think through like you would any other writing project when you're writing a rubric. What's your purpose? What's your context? Who's your audience? These are our three big questions. So first of all, so what is your purpose? Is the rubric even the genre that you want to use? So the rubric is just one grading tool. It's a grading tool that's particularly good if you want to show some kind of progression through an assignment or some kind of clear conventions. So I'll often use a rubric with an assignment like a proposal where I want a really specific format for my students to follow. It's also a rubric, however, is not good if you have an assignment where you want a lot of variety, like a creative writing assignment or a personal narrative, or there's unknown factors like is there a community partner the students are working with, or some component of the project that would be beyond their control. In that case, maybe a rubric isn't the best way to grade and grade fairly. So one of the things I'd like you to think about is what's the purpose of your assignment and what do you want students to learn? And is that best assessed by a rubric? So there's lots of other ways to assess writing. A grading contract, a checklist, is it really just a matter of you want them to hit certain things and they can check it off, they did it. You could have more holistic grading criteria, like the holistic rubric I showed. It wouldn't even need to be in the form of a scale. It could just be like, these are the things I'm looking for when I'm grading your rubric. Sometimes you'll see this called a question-based rubric. This is an example from a textbook called Engaging Ideas. It's about teaching writing. It just says, how do I assign letter grades? Well, in grading your thesis papers, I'm going to ask these questions. Does this paper have a thesis? So it's questions for students to check in their own work. But it's not a rubric because it's not saying you have to reach this certain level of thesis. Just, do you have one? Does it address your topic? It has to do it to a certain level. All right, if you're thinking like a writer, the next thing you need to look at is what's your context. Think about your institutional context. So what kind of school are you working at? What does your population of that school look like? What is their experience with writing? You don't want to use terms on your rubric or things that they wouldn't be familiar with. What grade level are they? So that has to do with how that course that you're teaching fits within that institution. Is this a freshman level course where they haven't had much experience with this? Or is it a senior level course, or maybe even an AP course where they're going to be graded on a rubric for their AP exam? So you want to set that precedent and get them used to that formula for grading. Also think about where this assignment fits in your course. Is it the first thing you've taught? Is it later in the semester? What do they know? Have you taught them about using MLA format? If not, you don't want to take a rubric that has MLA format on it and just use it. So again, thinking about, does this dimension of the rubric apply? And I think this comes a lot from adapting rubrics from other sources or pulling them from online, or even if your school gives you a rubric. But maybe that rubric asks for sources and you aren't requiring sources on that project. Well, you shouldn't have it on the rubric then. Or does your course even teach about syntax and mechanics? If you aren't teaching it, don't put it in the assessment. Another thing to think about is who is the audience for your rubric. Sometimes rubrics are used for this bigger scale scoring where you're looking at not just your class or not just your students. It's not even going back to the students. You have to report to someone, the principal or the state, about how students are doing. Well, in that case, they're going to know a lot about assessment. They're going to know a lot about outcomes. You won't need to define the terminology in the same way you would for students. Students may not know specific terminology, and what they're really after is doing well in the assignment. So you need to make sure that you know who's reading your rubric. If you are making a rubric for the classroom that students are going to use, it'd be great to involve them in the design. That's a great way for them to process the assignment as well and tell you what they think will work, will be an A paper versus a B paper versus a C paper. They'll show you how they're understanding the assignment. You can also conduct usability tests by asking students or others in your department or others from other fields to interpret your rubric. Give it to them, ask them how they use it, how they understand the terms and the dimensions of the rubric. And then lastly, be sure after you use the rubric that you take some notes on how it went. Was there something that you didn't include that you saw a lot of students doing, either for better or worse, something that you want to highlight and give them credit for? Say a good paper does this, and I didn't realize that that was something I was looking for. Or maybe there's a problem that keeps coming up that wasn't in your assessment tool. So any kind of assessment tool, just not just rubrics, you want to take notes after you've used it to see how you can improve it in the future. Another thing to think about, especially when we get to that grammar and style or mechanics section, is how to make your rubric more multicultural. So you want to really invoke the student's agency here and stress their choice in their own writing and their context that they're writing for. You want to encourage them to be thoughtful, but also experiment with their writing and take risks. So you want to avoid words in your rubric like standard or error-free or fluency. These often come up when we talk about grammar. But they really assume that you have this student with a particular language background. The last thing I want to say is about how good rubrics plus good assignment prompts equal good student writing. Now, I don't think that they are the only factors involved. Certainly, there's a lot more that contributes to how your students do in their writing. However, I think that the two of these genres together can really work well. This is what happens when we take assessment out of the classroom or we use rubrics to assess student work and we don't have the assignment prop from the classroom. Then there's this gap. So think about how your rubric works with your assignment prompt. Make sure it matches it. Make sure you're assessing the same things you're asking students to do on the assignment prompt. Make sure you're using the same vocabulary. Don't say context in the assignment sheet and then audience on the rubric. Make sure you're using the same words. And maybe that's where creating that glossary is a very helpful task for you and your students. Maybe that's something you can do together. What are the key words on this assignment? What are the key words in this rubric? Also, let your students know that these two things work together. That they, when they're writing their assignment, they should be looking at both. They shouldn't be just worried about the grade. They should be looking back at the actual assignment prompt. Or they shouldn't just look at the assignment prompt and not look at the rubric or the grading criteria. Those two things are meant to work together to inform them on how they complete the assignment. And finally, make sure that they also use it at different points in the writing process. So when they're peer reviewing, this is a great time to bring their attention back to the rubric. Or when they're revising a paper, to point out, like, here's the area of the rubric that you are missing. All right, so here are a couple sources I've used throughout this. This article on multicultural rubrics is really great. This was where that question rubric came from. And this was that article about error. Good luck creating rubrics or other grading criteria.